Hello, global gardeners. Welcome to another Gardening Monday. We've got a lot of information to talk about today, the pros and cons of raised beds, and I'll be sharing a lot of information on that topic, along with answering your questions as they appear throughout the next 90 minutes. Great to see everybody here today. I want to give a shout out to Eric Hall, a member of the GardenerScott YouTube community. Thanks for joining along as a member. And there are a number of members of the channel with us today. Always great to see everybody. Here's one of them. Great to see you back. Anita was the inspiration last week for the philosophy session. So glad that you're here today, along with David. Nice to see you here. Lakewood, Colorado, up the road a little bit. First time been able to participate in the real time. I'm excited for you as well. So nice to see everybody checking in from all over the place. Bonjour, Jean-Pierre, all the way from Europe watching us in Brussels. It's so great. And today we've got all three moderators. Kiri is off from school this week. So we've got Jay, who's already quite active, Heidi, and Kiri that will be moderating and helping to answer your questions along the way, because I just can't get to everything. So thank you in advance to all of you for the questions that are coming, and to all of you who throw out the answers that I can't throw out myself. Great to see you here. This is Thanksgiving week here in the United States. And so I'm hoping to see a lot of people that normally wouldn't be here because of vacation time that is often awarded during this week of Thanksgiving. Let's jump into why I want to talk about raised beds today. This actually started as a question from Phil Lambert a couple weeks ago. And he asked, is it possible to garden without raised beds? And of course, if that was the only part of the question, the answer is, of course it is. Gardeners have been gardening without raised beds for generations. But it's the second part of the raised bed or the second part of the question that really raises the discussion of raised beds to another level. Because he was concerned about the best way to garden while keeping weeds and rodents out of ground level beds. And this is actually a big reason why I used raised beds. And here's a picture of my garden yesterday. We got our first dusting of snow. But I use a lot of raised beds because of the pests I have in my garden area. Primarily the rabbits. And you've seen this in many of my videos where I'll be filming and a rabbit will run across the background. That is quite common. Raised beds, like mine, are high enough that they deter the rabbits. The rabbits can still jump into the beds, but the height deters them. It redirects the rabbits to another area. One of the big reasons I use raised beds as well, and you can see this in some of my videos where I'm filling my raised beds, at the bottom of the beds I put a barrier. Now I use hardware cloth and or chicken wire at the bottom of my beds because I also have gophers. And so that barrier underneath the bed helps keep the gophers from digging into the beds. I also have voles, which are a small rodent, and the height of the bed and that barrier at the bottom keep the voles out. And so to Phil's point, if you have rodents, if you have pests, raised beds are often the best way to deal with those pests. It's a deterrence. If the gopher, if the rabbit, if the vole really wants to get into these beds, they'll find a way. But I don't have a problem with that because there's lots of other area for those animals to find something to eat. So right off the bat, that's a great reason to have raised beds if you've got those pests. But you don't have to do a raised bed. You can do all of your gardening in in-ground beds and put a fence around the area. A fence that's high enough to keep out the rabbits and any of those pests that might want to jump the fence. It's got to be high enough to keep them out. The issue becomes for voles and gophers, what do you do in an in-ground level bed area? Well, in those cases, it works best to bury the fence. And so gophers will tend to burrow relatively close to the surface. And so if you dig a trench around your garden area, that's 15 to 18 inches deep, about half a meter, and bury the fence that deep, that will act as a deterrence for those burrowing pests in most cases. So I think it's a little bit easier for me in my garden to have raised beds for the pest concern, but I could easily dig the trenches. My soil just is really compacted, and so it's difficult to dig in my native soil. It's easier for me to build up and garden higher. And we'll talk more reasons about why I think raised beds can be beneficial. Heidi pointed out earlier, the height of the bed as you get older makes it easier to do a lot of the gardening. You don't have to kneel. You don't have to get up and down on the ground tending to your plants. A raised bed tends to make it easier in those kind of situations. So throw out your ideas for the raised beds. And Jeannie says the same thing. I like raised beds because I'm old and decrepit. It saves on back pain and injuries. And so my beds are a nice sturdy wood. As you've seen in my videos as well, I sit on them. It's a nice easy way because I'm getting old and decrepit too with back pain, and the raised beds definitely make a difference in that respect. So age, I think, does play a role. In 20 years, 25 years ago in all of my gardens, I had no raised beds. It was all in-ground beds. I was growing on a slope when I first moved here to Colorado, and so the beds were terraced, but it was all level ground. I did not build a bed to grow plants in, but as I've gotten older, I'm doing almost exclusively raised bed gardening. So Urban Chicken Mama says, I love my raised beds. Hoop houses have kept the frost off of them so far. And that's also another great reason why I like my raised beds. All of my beds are the same size, 4 feet wide by 8 feet long. And I have hoops that are cut to fit that length. And so it's very easy to put hoops on all of these beds, cover it with plastic, and protect the plants on days like you see behind me. So there's a vote for raised beds. Shandy saying, voles, yes, I'm still trying each different style. I call my teeny yard my classroom style. And so most of you know that I have a new pup, Mala, and I've had her for a couple months now. With her in place, I haven't seen rabbits in a while, and this last week she caught her first mouse. And I was looking closely to see if it might be a vole, but it was a field mouse. And so I'm expecting that I'll have fewer and fewer rodent issues, but I'm still going to do future beds, maybe not this high anymore because I don't have to worry about the rabbits, but I'll still have that underlayment, that wire barrier, just in case some of those burrowing animals are there. Mala's doing everything she can to find gophers. She's doing a lot of digging, and I'm doing my best to keep her from digging in the garden area. But a young dog can make a difference, and I would be a bit concerned because when she gets crazy, she'll jump across all of these beds as she runs from one area to another. So I'm still working on that. An in-ground bed, if you've got a pest, like we talked about, you put a fence around it. That pest could be a cat or a dog as well. And so I'm trying to figure out if I need to fence some of my areas just because I have such an excitable dog. Okay, let's see what we have. Barbara is asking, what kind of wood have you used to build your beds? And so I've used all kinds of wood. So most of the wood in these beds is basic fir. I do use pressure treated wood as the base. You can see there's a color difference here. So I've got pressure treated wood at the base, and I've got basic fir at the top. And I'm not worried at all about any chemicals leaching from the pressure treated wood. Years and years ago, there was a treatment for the wood that was arsenic based, and that could cause problems. But the wood, at least in the United States, the pressure treated wood is done with a copper based chemical, and copper is naturally occurring in our soils, and copper is actually one of those elements that can benefit plants. Now, the little bit of research that's out there that I've read shows minimal leaching of chemicals from the wood into the soil. And what does leach is copper, and that's not going to be harmful for plants. So I'm not worried about it, but just to be on the safe side a little bit to avoid any potential concerns, because there isn't a lot of research out there. That's why I put the pressure treated wood on the bottom, because the roots typically aren't getting that deep. That bottom layer is just to give me a high bed. I'm doing most of my growing in the depth of the top half. I've also grown using redwood. Redwood is a great wood to use. It's resistant to rot, but it's much more expensive. I've done a little bit of gardening using cedar for the same reason. Cedar is rot resistant, but it tends to be more expensive. I'm moving more and more away from the wood beds, partly because wood is just so expensive these days, which is why my most recent beds were made using metal. And as you'll see in future videos to come, I'm doing a lot more with concrete and cement board. And one of the videos that I have shows how I made the concrete block bed, this cinder block, actually concrete block bed. So that's the direction I'm moving. But to answer your question, all kinds of different woods, whatever tends to be available. And the reason I use basic fir or pine is because it tends to be the least expensive. And in my area that's dry, I don't get a lot of rain, I don't have to worry about the rot. I don't have to worry about the wood decaying, which is why I can use the cheap woods like pine and fir and not worry about them rotting away. So that's a big reason for my choice of woods. If you lived in a wetter region, you might want to consider choosing a wood that is resistant to rot when it gets wet. And Yankee Sisters checking on. Always nice to see you on a Monday. Thank you for that super chat. Listening while prepping some harvested vegetables and pies for Thanksgiving. Enjoy this thankful holiday. I hope you have a wonderful holiday. This has always been one of my favorite times of year as far as the garden is concerned. I'm still planting out. The oldest plants in my garden are only 2 years old at this point. But a big reason why I grow raspberries is because in years past, when my raspberry patches became mature and I could harvest a few dozen pounds of raspberries each year, on Thanksgiving, I love nothing more in the menu than to make a fresh raspberry pie. And I know Kiri is on today. I'm sure she can attest to the raspberry pies that I've made in the past with raspberries from the garden. So I love that you're using your harvest for your meal. That's awesome. And I encourage everyone to do that as often as possible. That doesn't have to be Thanksgiving, but that is a great time here in the U.S. where we get our family together. And I'm thinking about looking to the future, to the next big holiday, our Christmas holiday, and thinking about maybe doing a roast beef. And so in this green raised bed right there, I have some horseradish. And so I think I'm going to harvest horseradish in the next week or two before the ground freezes, and then store that so I can make fresh horseradish sauce for prime rib, which is another great thing I like growing and using because it's unlike anything you can get in the store. And so I wanted to go ahead and point out these beds as well, because if you don't do a lot of raised bed gardening and you don't want to go to the expense or the effort to build all of these kind of wood beds like I do, you can still have some raised beds, like these metal animal troughs that I have, and I use them for the invasive plants, which is another great reason of why raised bed gardening may be a better choice. In this bed right here, I have mint growing. If mint were in an in-ground bed, it could easily take over the garden. But by keeping it in a single raised bed, I'm keeping it under control. And this other bed, as I just pointed out, was horseradish. Horseradish can become invasive and take over a garden as well. And so putting it into its own bed, a nice raised bed like these metal troughs, is an advantage to raised bed gardening, because the plant, unless something goes wrong, is not going to escape that raised bed that you're using for that plant. So think about those kind of reasons when you're deciding on whether you want to do a raised bed or not. A lot depends on the plant. I grow my corn in the ground. I grow a lot of my squashes and pumpkins in the ground. This area right here is my hugelkultur mound. So technically it's a raised bed. It rises above the level surface. But I treat it like an in-ground bed, and this is where I grow zucchini and yellow squash and all of my pumpkins. So you don't have to do one or the other. I mix it up a lot. Mostly raised beds, but still a lot of in-ground growing. And so you see that a lot, but it's one of those kind of things that it's a personal choice. And I encourage, especially as you get older, you start thinking more and more about raised beds if you're not currently doing it. And so Arizona Highland Homesteads mint, strawberries, and other runner plants should always be in a raised beds. And that's a good point. So this other raised bed that I have back here with my archway, that's where I've got my strawberries. So you're exactly right. I think that's a good idea. Anything that can spread and move into areas that you don't want them to be, those plants should be in a raised bed, because that's another great advantage. You can keep your plants under control. Now, that being said, I have started some areas in the garden in this back area back here where I'm creating an area where I'm not going to be walking and where there aren't going to be a lot of plants, but I'm using strawberries as ground cover in that area. So I am doing it on purpose. Those strawberries with their runners, I'm hoping, will fill that space as a ground cover just to add some variation to the plants. But for the strawberries that I'm harvesting and eating and enjoying, yes, I agree with you completely. I keep them in my raised bed. Okay, let's see what else we have. Heidi's wondering, do you make holes in your metal stock tank beds? Yes. And so I've got a video where I show how I put these together, and I drill holes in the bottom. I probably don't need it for my area because we don't get a lot of rain. I haven't seen rain in weeks and weeks and weeks. And so the reason to put holes in a metal bed is for drainage. These are animal troughs. They're made for horses and cattle for filling with water so that they can drink out of them. So when it rains, that water is going to be held in these tanks unless there's a hole for drainage. So because it's so dry, because we get so little rain, I think that I don't need it, because the rain would fill up that tank, but eventually would be used by the plant or evaporate for me. But to be on the safe side, yes, I definitely recommend that you drill holes so that can drain away and you don't end up with a pond instead of a little metal raised bed. So good question. Thanks for asking that. Okay, let's see. There's a question about growing strawberry and asparagus together. And so let's see if I can find the original. Nikki, I planted strawberries in with my asparagus in an in-ground bed, and now the strawberries are filling up the space. Will they choke out the asparagus? Possibly. This is actually a pretty good combination. And so anything that you put in an asparagus bed, you need to consider the roots. Asparagus is typically going to be pretty deep in the bed. 8 to 15 inches deep is typically where we're going to put our asparagus roots, and they're going to stay there for the life of the plant. Strawberry is typically only going to be 3, maybe 4 inches deep that the roots are going to grow. And so as far as the roots are concerned, the plants are not competing for nutrients. They're not going to really affect each other because you've got a deep-rooted plant with a shallow-rooted plant. So this can be a very good combination. The issue comes in with the way these plants grow. And so the asparagus is going to sprout in spring and send up all those new shoots. Well, they need to grow straight up. And if there's a strawberry plant where that asparagus wants to break ground, it can be a problem for the asparagus because the roots of the strawberry are going to hold it in place and it's going to fight back that new growth of the asparagus. This, if you're growing asparagus, leads to how you thin out the plants like the strawberries. You're not going to thin out the asparagus. Keep your asparagus growing throughout the year. And so you can see almost, it's in this bed back here that I have asparagus. And so these these feathery brown plants right there, those are my asparagus fronds that have faded in the cold weather. If I were growing strawberry in that bed, I would make sure I was keeping the asparagus growing through the year. And as the runners of the strawberry begin spreading them out, keep them away from the asparagus plants. Then when those runners, those new strawberry plants root, you're not going to have an issue with the asparagus. The next year, as the asparagus begins to spread a little bit, you should have advance notice to see if the asparagus and the strawberry might be too close together for the next year. Well, you can just dig up the strawberry plants and put them someplace else or take them out completely. So it takes a little bit of extra work. If you do nothing with your strawberries, yes, they can overtake the bed and essentially choke out the asparagus in time. But hopefully that isn't an issue because strawberries are a plant that typically have about a 3-year lifespan. And so at the end of 3 years, you really should be pulling out your older strawberry plants because the production of those plants is really going to drop dramatically. And so that's one reason why strawberries and asparagus can be good companions, because it's part of normal strawberry growing to remove the plants every 2 or 3 years anyway. And the plants you remove are going to be the ones that would be competing with the asparagus. So good question. Glad that you asked that. PD's wondering, for the first year of growing asparagus crowns, do I just let the tall growth as is or do I prune? No, absolutely. Leave it. Leave it completely, even with older plants. So these plants I just put in the ground 2 years ago and I didn't harvest at all this year. Next year, in their 3rd season, I'll do some harvesting, but just let it grow. Let it grow through the season. Let those fronds develop. Those leaves will get the energy for the roots through the photosynthesis. So always let your asparagus grow after you've harvested whatever you want to get in the spring, and continue to do that every year. If you prune your asparagus, eventually the asparagus is going to fade away and die because it needs to grow during the summer to revitalize the roots that are underneath. So and Nikki's saying, sounds like I need to thin my strawberries. Yeah, it's in fact these beds I mentioned with the strawberries, this will be the 3rd year as well. So going into this 3rd year, those older plants that have already given lots of babies, they'll be coming out this year. But those babies, those runners, will stay in place. I'll move some of them to other areas, but you've got to stay up with your strawberries, and yeah, you need to prune them from time to time to keep the bed fresh and to get the most production. Dr. Trott's low carb living. Do you divide strawberries like perennials? It looks like I have a few with 2 crowns. So normally you're going to have a single crown, but as the plant ages, and this is one of those, the older plants are going to have multiple crowns. So if you've got 2 crowns, it's probably a 2-year-old plant, maybe a 3-year-old plant. You can divide them like perennials, but once you split a strawberry plant, that crown is now going to be injured where you split it, and you need to let it cure. You don't want mulch on top of it. You don't want it to get overly wet, because the strawberry crowns can rot pretty easily, especially if they've been damaged. But in the case of these older strawberries, they're not going to be producing the fruit, as much fruit as you would like. So yes, you can divide a strawberry plant, but the plant isn't going to do as well in recovery, and it's an older plant to start with, most likely, so it's also already giving you less production. So far better to just let some runners go and pot up those runners, or allow those runners to grow wherever they fall on the ground, than to attempt to divide strawberries, because those divisions are going to fade. They're going to be old, and you're going to a lot of work to get extra plants, and the plants just really aren't going to give you the harvest you want. So instead, just go with the runners. That's really the best way to propagate and get more of the strawberries that you're after. Llama says, I transplanted all of the runners to my GreenStalk and put all the old strawberry plants poking out of the compost. Fun experiment, plus food for the deer to keep them away from the good stuff. And I did close to the same thing. I haven't pulled out all of my strawberries, but my new GreenStalk planter, that's what I did. I dug up the young plants from the runners, and I filled that GreenStalk tower with strawberry plants. And so it's kind of an experiment for me as well. I'll have an entire GreenStalk loaded with strawberries, and I'm working to make sure I can keep them alive through the winter, depending on how harsh our winter is. Did a recent video where I showed a cover that GreenStalk makes that I put over my tower, and I've been using that every day. I'll put that on at night and take it off during the day, and I'll continue to do that over the winter to keep those strawberries in that tower as warm and alive as possible. Do realize, if you're doing strawberries in a container, that they can dry out very easily in the winter, so you should water occasionally just so the soil doesn't dry out. So on warm days, if it looks like the soil that might have been frozen is beginning to thaw, that's a good time to consider watering plants in containers, like a GreenStalk if you're growing strawberries. So Llama, we'll have to compare notes in springtime to see how our strawberries did in our GreenStalk. I'm looking forward to it. I think it's going to be a nice and hopefully successful experiment. And in the description below today, I did put a link to the GreenStalk site, because starting today for the next week, they're having their Black Friday sales. So if you've been wanting another GreenStalk, or your first GreenStalk, or you want to buy a GreenStalk for a holiday gift for somebody, check out the sale, because they've got some great prices for the next week. And Black Friday sales are already starting all around the country, and GreenStalk is definitely on that bandwagon. So I got an email from them. I put that link below. And if you do that, do use the GardenerScott at checkout as a code, because it'll save you some money. And I don't get the money from that code you use. It's purely a savings to you. And hopefully that's something that you can use if you've been thinking about GreenStalk. But now's one of the times to do it. So think about it if you haven't done it. Urban Chicken Mama says, I have 3-tier milk crate towers, and I'm going to try growing strawberries in them next. My raised bed is overrun with them. That's cool. I did some milk crate growing years and years ago at the school, but that's a good idea. I should probably add that to my list of videos to do as we move forward, is to do some milk crate growing. So I hope you have some good success with that. I think that sounds like a great idea. Strawberries, are a really sturdy, hardy plant. But you just have to make sure that they don't dry out. If they dry out, they'll still survive in most cases, but the production of the fruit drops dramatically. So if you could put it in a nice, rich, well-draining soil and keep the soil evenly moist, you'll have strawberries for about 3 years. The first year you should expect some production. It typically peaks in the second year and then it begins fading after that. But milk crates, GreenStalks, all kinds of containers, it's a great option. And another thing, if you haven't thought about this with strawberries, and this holds true in raised bed gardening as well, use them as a border plant around your bed. And so in this area over here, that you really can't see, but you'll know it from my videos, this is where I have my concrete block bed. And that's one of the things I did this year is as the runners were growing, I put strawberries in that bed. And then I directed the runners to actually root in the holes of the concrete blocks. And so this next year, probably about a third of the blocks right now have strawberries in them. And there's an option for growing strawberries. You don't have to have a dedicated bed. You can do it in raised beds like this. You can do it in the concrete blocks. You can just have a border, a single row of plants around the edge of your bed, and then do all the normal growing inside the bed. And that's a great way to incorporate strawberries in your garden, and they'll be a permanent fixture for a few years. But you can still amend the bed, you can still mulch, you can still grow, you can still do everything you might normally do. You just have an extra fruit crop that's growing around the border of your bed. So it's something to think about as a new thing to try if you haven't already done something along those lines. Another thing I want to talk about in the raised bed arena. And so I talked about my raised beds, a couple of the reasons why I have them. I do need to point out that for me in my region, raised beds might not be the best option. One of the advantages to raised beds is that they've got great drainage. And so if you're in a really wet area, you can put a raised bed in above a soggy soil and grow in a nice moist soil. In a region like mine, where I get so little rainfall and not a lot of snow in winter, the beds tend to have that good drainage, but because they're exposed on all four sides, they're drying out faster. And so in a very dry region, you can actually have more success with sunken beds, where you actually dig a big trench and you grow lower in the ground so that any rain falls into the trench and helps keep the soil moist. It helps keep it cooler in the hot sun, and it doesn't dry out as quickly. So if I didn't have the back issues, and if I didn't want that high area to keep the pests out, it would make more sense for me in my region that's so dry to not grow in raised beds. So I love the advantages they give me. But I do have to point out that it's not necessarily the best way to garden. I do have to water more. I do have to spend more attention on the beds, which is why I mulch so much on those beds, because the mulch helps cut down on the evaporation of water from the soil. And so start bringing those considerations as you're choosing your beds. These metal beds back here, minimal evaporation, because there's nothing escaping from the sides. The metal is not absorbing any moisture like these wood beds might. And as long as the top is mulched, I can keep those metal raised beds moist more easily than in the wood raised beds. So lots of things to think about. It's not as simple as just put in a raised bed and everything will go great. You do have to match it with what you're growing and where you're growing to have the best success. Okay, let's see if we have anything else that's popping up. David saying, I use raised beds due to being in Conway, South Carolina, near Myrtle Beach. The soil here is all so sandy. Another great reason, and that's another huge reason why I do raised beds in my area. It's because my soil is so poor and it's compacted and it's very difficult to dig. And so I can put in a raised bed, bring in good soil, and be able to grow right away. And so, good point, David. I completely agree. If you have poor soil or contaminated soil, and you want to be able to grow in a garden that you might not be able to grow in otherwise, raised beds are your answer there as well, because you can build your own soil or purchase bulk soil to fill those beds, and you know what you're growing in without having to deal with all sand or all clay or whatever the soil problems might need to be. So definitely keep that in mind as you're deciding. If you haven't decided, or if you're thinking about adding more, soil and soil choices is definitely a big reason. Jean-Pierre, nice to see you again. Can a raised bed not harm the microsoil and fungi, because that fungi spreading out all over the garden and right outside? So it all depends how you treat your soil. And so because I'm using a lot of organic matter in my soil, I actually have more soil life in these raised beds than I do outside the raised beds. In the area back here, this is where I have my fruit trees, and I have a really thick wood chip mulch. The wood chips are going to be food for that fungi, for different types of fungus that are growing around those trees. So a lot of it depends on what you're growing. Trees and bushes and shrubs tend to like a soil that has more fungi than bacteria. And so a wood chip mulch or a woody mulch can really encourage that type of growth. In raised beds like this, most of the vegetable garden plants we're growing prefer a bacterial dominant soil, one that has more compost and decomposed plant matter than the woody matter. So a lot of it depends on what you're growing and how you're amending as to whether it's a good idea. But this is a good point. Depending on what you're doing in your beds, you can be affecting and even disrupting the soil life in your beds. And the soil life is critical to the success of your plant life. And so it depends. It depends on how you're growing. I try to minimize the amount of digging that I do and the amount of disruption, so that as I develop the soil life, I'm not disrupting it, but I'm feeding it with compost primarily in the vegetable garden and wood chips primarily outside the vegetable garden. So I hope that helps out a little bit, Jean-Pierre. It really does matter, and it is something that can easily be done wrong as far as trying to grow plants in a soil that just isn't going to allow them to grow. Now, in an area like this hugelkultur bed, where the base, I dug a big trench here, and in that trench, I buried logs and branches, and then covered that with some soil and covered that with compost. And I've got some wood chip mulch on top of here. So I treat that as an in-ground bed, but it is a vegetable garden bed that I'm growing, as I mentioned, the pumpkins and the squashes. Even though I'm using more wood-based product in that bed, I still have the compost that I use. So it's a blend of the bacteria and the fungi in that particular bed that's outside my normal wooden and metal raised bed area. And the plants I'm growing there do well in that balanced eco environment where it's got both the bacteria and the fungi working. So, and then like Mage Grey Wolf is saying, live worms in a bag of Kellogg's potting soil. That's awesome. But that's also a big consideration in all of this, is allowing access for the worms. And so in these raised beds, I mentioned I have that wire underlayment. The worms can still get back and forth between the native soil and the beds. I am not an advocate of using a weed cloth, some type of hard barrier underneath your raised beds, because that action of the earthworms in the soil into the bed and then out of the bed again, I think is really important to help spread some of the nutrients around to other areas, because those earthworms will help spread some of the bacteria that they're eating, and also some of the spores from the fungi that they're eating. They'll spread that to other areas of your garden if you allow space for those earthworms to move. And so I've found earthworms in this bed that I didn't put there, but now that there's all that decomposing matter, the earthworms have found it. And I've got worms in these beds as well, and I have no doubt that they're traveling back and forth because they're next to each other. They're real close. So a lot of it has really made a difference in the improvement of the soil. Masabi Gal, hi, nice to see you again. My wood chips were composted for 7 years. Awesome. I mixed them half and half with garden soil I had delivered. Worked great and smelled awesome. Mushroomy. Absolutely. Mushroom is the fruit of the fungus, and the fungus is feeding on the wood chips, so it is going to smell mushroomy. That's awesome. I'm planning on doing that as well. I've got some wood chips way back here that I'm going to be leaving in a pile for years for that same reason, to break down and become a soil amendment in the future, a way to add some of that fungus back to the beds as they balance with the bacteria with a lot of the plants that I'm growing. So awesome. That's good for you. I agree with you, Jake. Provide bed and breakfast and the worms will come. And I've mentioned this before. Worms are just incredible. There are different types of worms. They'll burrow to different depths. They'll migrate at different rates. But at the Galileo School Garden all those years ago with the garden, terrible soil. It was former tennis courts. And so there was a foundation of concrete that 10-foot high fences were put into that surrounded the tennis courts. The soil was crushed granite and a lot of rock. You would not think that a worm could get through that area, but had a big area outside the greenhouse where we buried leaves and all of the garden waste, all the organic matter we could find, we put into this big hole, and we were making our own soil in a very large area. The worms found it. It was incredible. The next year, as I began working in that area to start putting some trees in, the number of worms, because we had provided food in an area where there was no food previously. Now there was food for the worms. So they're migrating, they're moving, they're looking for food. And if they find a nice food-rich area, yeah, definitely it's a buffet for them, and they'll move in. And more likely that they'll find an in-ground bed than a raised bed. But over time, you can expect that they're going to find your raised bed if you've got all that organic matter in it, which is another reason when I do my raised beds on the bottom half, as I've shown in videos, just like this hugelkultur mound, I have buried branches and twigs and leaves, lots of organic matter on the base level of these beds to encourage that soil life, particularly the earthworms as they're rolling through. They're going to find lots of good stuff to eat in those beds and hopefully stay in those beds as the plants are growing. Okay, let's see what else we have popping up. Nikki says the worms disappeared in my compost pile this summer. They're back in abundance due to the rain, I'm guessing. Yeah, and so worms really are susceptible to changes in temperature. And so if you have a cool compost pile, and I tend to do cool composting or cold composting, the worms are going to find an abundance of food. But when that pile starts warming up, when the bacteria becomes active and it begins generating heat, that heat's going to be too much for the earthworms, so they'll leave. Then when the pile cools down again, or the rains cool the pile, the earthworms will return. So I've had questions before, where did my earthworms go? Well, it's probably because the pile just got too hot, and when it cools down, the earthworms will return. If you want your compost to be decomposed by the help of worms, then strive to keep a cooler pile. And one of the reasons I like to have a cool pile is because I've got earthworm castings all throughout it. A lot of us will pay for worm castings. Well, you can make your own compost that already has worm castings in it. So I don't have hot piles. Occasionally I get warm piles, but I tend to have some really good compost because it's got a lot of good growth of the bacteria in addition to the worms. And so when I like that bag that was mentioned, I use compost in my beds, and it's normal for that compost to have worms in it, which is a great way to incorporate worms into your raised beds. Make your own compost that has worms in it, use that compost in your beds, and now you're introducing the worms into your garden beds. That's one of the easiest ways to spread the worms throughout your garden. Urban Chicken Mama, thank you so much for that contribution on this wonderful Monday. I appreciate you being here, and I thank you for helping out the channel. That's so nice of you. Thanks. Okay, let's see what else we have. Scott Head is here. Late to arrive, but glad to be here. Scott Head has one of the great gardening channels you've heard me talk about before. Just had a video there he released, calls it the most boring video ever, but I don't think it's the most boring video ever, but it's all about doing chores in the garden. And so many of us are doing chores in our garden at this time of year. And so Scott shows some of the chores he's doing to get ready for his Texas winter. I think, and I did make a comment along these lines, if you're going to be doing chores, you might as well be doing the chores in your garden and your yard, because as we talked about in the philosophy last week, it has a different feeling. Those chores that might seem like work someplace else in the garden, they just really don't seem like work. It's just something that you get out there and you can commune with nature and your plants and everything else. So glad to see you here today, Scott. So nice to have you on. And Scott knows a lot, so wouldn't be surprised if he doesn't throw in some good information in the comments section. So Greg says, was just watching the chores video, reminding me I need to rebuild my compost enclosure as well. Lila says she saw that video, and Connie says she just saw the video. So that's great. We've got a lot of people that are watching both my videos and Scott Head's video. So that's awesome. And as always, you know, Scott is like me, cranking out the videos, trying to show you what we're doing right and wrong and pass along good information along the way. So Jay's great at keeping up with it. Here's a link to Scott's channel. If you haven't visited it, go check it out. The Black Gumbo Southern Gardening Channel has got some really good stuff. And I don't know if you know Scott, but I'm growing a little bit of a beard, so we'll see how we look here in another month. A new look for the GardenerScott channel. Greg says, my neighbor thinks I'm nuts because I mowed and bagged all his leaves from my garden and compost pile. Well, if that's nuts, then I think all of us should be nuts. I did that yesterday. I went and picked up a trailer load of bags of leaves from a family friend, a good friend of my daughter. And I don't think it's crazy. I don't think it's nuts. I think it's a great idea. And as chores go, this is one of the best chores you can be doing in the fall when you finally have access to leaves. So good for you, Greg. I think that's exactly what you should be doing. It's how many bags did we get? I think she had 10 or 12 bags, but that'll be enough to really help with a lot of what I'm doing. And I'm hoping to get more bags over this shoulder right here. That's my big bin that last year I put in about 20 to 30 bags of leaves to make leaf mold. And if you saw that short video I did a couple of weeks ago, the leaf mold is developing very well. Leaves can be used in so many different ways. I use them primarily as a mulch, but like I'm doing with the leaf mold, and like we were talking about a pile of wood chips, they'll break down and create some amazing soil amendment. And so collect those bags, use them in your compost, use them as mulch, use them to make leaf mold, but definitely use them in your garden. It's one of those things that that I highly recommend. Mr. Grimm says, I mowed up my neighbor's leaves yesterday. They needed the help and I needed their leaves as I have no trees. Helped us both out. Good for you. And that's why I do it too. You can see I don't have the trees in my garden yet. The little fruit trees I have are not enough to provide the leaves in the amount that I really like using them. So, and you raise a good point. Yeah, help your neighbors out. If you've got a neighbor that needs a yard cleared of leaves, just to be a nice neighbor, or because maybe they just don't have the ability to do it anymore, help them out and you get the leaves as payment. So definitely a win-win across the board. So yeah, Scott says good time of year for a beard. So I completely agree. And it makes it easier, especially with the cold weather that we've started seeing. We're jumping up and down and up and down. We might have some snow on Thanksgiving Eve, but we'll see. Officially, I'm a higher elevation than Colorado Springs that I live near, which is why I had this dusting of snow, but the city hasn't had any snow yet. So we'll see if we can actually get some going here pretty soon. Okay, Carrie says, I still need to rake my leaves. So depending on what you're going to do with your leaves, Carrie, hopefully you'll be able to use them. Carrie's done a lot more gardening at her house this year, so I hope you get to keep all your leaves, but I'll take whatever you don't want. Wayne's saying, wondering how to deal with moles in the garden. They're working on eating earthworms. So yes, if there is a disadvantage to having earthworms in your garden, it's moles. Moles and voles and gophers are going to be going out after those worms. So as far as with dealing with the moles, you can try to trap them. You can try to poison them. I don't recommend poisoning, especially if you've got children or pets in the garden. Or, like I pointed out earlier, I just accept that I've got gophers in areas of my garden, and I build up with a barrier underneath the metal that the mole or the gopher can't dig through. We don't have moles in Colorado, believe it or not. That's a great advantage to our state. We don't have the moles, but we do have the gophers. And so working in your soil, and this is one of those times we often try to do no dig gardening, but if you're working in your soil a lot, and if you're digging and tilling, that's enough to drive gophers and moles out, because they aren't going to be digging and staying in an area that is being disrupted on a regular basis. And if you see the tunnels coming in your garden, get out there and start digging up the tunnels, because they'll go someplace else. That's kind of the approach I've taken, is to accept that they're in my garden area, but I try to stay so active in the garden that they tend to stay in an area that's not near my garden, an area that's way over there. And now that I've got Mala's actually digging up all of their tunnels in that area, so I'm hoping that she'll drive them out. I also have had great success this year because I'm allowing them space, and that's the hawks and owls and any other type of predatory animal. I've talked about the cat that roams through my area. And so I encourage those animals that become the hunters of moles and gophers in a garden area. So you can try to encourage some of those predatory animals by not making your garden unfriendly. You can encourage birds to your garden, and I know this may sound a bit cruel, but birds can be a way to entice the owls and the hawks. And if the owls and the hawks are coming to your garden to feed on some of the birds that might be coming to your garden, well, if they see that there's gophers and moles in the garden, they might come back and feed on those the next time. So those are a couple of the ways that I deal with those burrowing animals. I hope that gives you a couple ideas, Wayne. It's one of those things that we all have pests that we have to deal with that are worse than others. Sometimes we have to live with them and accept and just have to modify how we garden because of the type that we type of pest that we have. So, okay, let's see what we have. Nikki says my neighbor gave leaves as well, and Carla saying great fun helping others with their gardens. And so I'll talk a little bit about that here in a little bit when we start getting to the philosophy phase. But yes, I think helping others out, and sure, if you can get the leaves, that's a payment, but just helping others out. Gardeners are giving people, and if you can help others, it's one of those things that I encourage it at every opportunity. Okay, let's see what else we have. Looks like there's a little bit of funkiness on the video. It's probably the feed from me, and because of the holiday, everybody's at home, so I guess the broadband is getting corrupted a little bit. Too many people trying to get on in my area. So let's hope that we get through it without too much more difficulty, but I'm guessing that's what the problem happened to be. Yeah, and Mr. Texas Bone, I agree with you. That's kind of the way I look at it as well. The gophers that are in my area that were digging tunnels, I didn't do anything to disrupt them until Mala came along, because that is a future garden area. That's where I'm planning in another year or two to put a nice formal herb garden in. And as I've already said, my soil is terrible. It's very compacted, but the gophers do a great job of decompacting the soil. And so I think it's great that they're digging up that whole area. And I think now it's great that Mala's running them out, because the soil in that area is looser than it ever was. And so when I put that garden in, it's been naturally tilled by the gophers. So even those pests that we think we want to get rid of may actually have some benefits to the garden. Tammy's saying, I encourage everything but the cats. They kill the rabbits and leave dead bodies all over and poop everywhere. The cats are the pests in my garden. The rabbits are fine. And that is one of those little presents that cats will leave that I do find very annoying when you dig and you're planting and then you come across the cat poop. That is not fun. But if they don't have the animals to hunt, or if the animals are more numerous in another area, they'll usually go to that other area. And I haven't seen the cat in a while, and I think that's because a lot of the pests I have are gone, or at least there's so few of them that at least my cat has moved on to another area. So I'm actually finding that to be a good thing. Patricia saying, I found the invasive hammerhead worms in my compost yard and flower beds. All I can do is kill them as I go. And there's the hammerhead worms and the jumping worms. There are a lot of those type of worms that are actually becoming a problem in the United States, and you'll probably see more and more information as there are more studies on how to deal with them. But I wish you luck with that. Eric's saying, how do you deal with June bug grubs? Does milky spore work on them? I've seen conflicting information. I've tried it, but it doesn't seem to work. We don't have June bugs in this area. I do have a lot of grubs. Now, one thing that you can do for grubs, and it can be very effective, but you need to time it right, is get chickens. My neighbor's chickens would jump the fence this last spring to eat the grubs, particularly in this bed right there, because it was all the wood chip mulch, and I had a ton of grubs in that. So disrupting them is a great way to deal with grubs. If you got chickens, the chickens will do it naturally. If you don't have chickens, then this is another reason why I like the raised beds, but you can do it in any bed. Do a spring soil amending, where you're actually going to be digging into the soil and turning it over. That should expose most of the grubs. And so then you can either pick them out or just leave them exposed, and the birds will come in and eat the grubs at that point. So that's some of what I do for the grub control, is to bring in either chickens or birds to help eat the grubs. But that's a nice natural way to do it, is just to dig them out of the soil and then kill them one way or another, by your hand or by some animal eating them. So that's what I do. If you've had June bug grubs and have an answer for Eric, by all means, throw it in the comments so we can share the information back and forth. And Kiri says, I planted strawberries in the front yard just for the bunnies. And I've done that as well, not with strawberries, but to put plants in. Another great way to deal with the pests. You've got the raised beds that are deterring the pests from getting to your plants. Well, give them some other plant to eat, and that's one. I've got an area way back here that I've got strawberries in as well, and as a ground cover. And in that area, that is why I put those strawberries in, was for the rabbits, so that they wouldn't come into the garden area. Now, since then, I haven't seen the rabbits back, but they'll be there as food when the time comes. So great strategy. Definitely something to think about. Sean Pierre saying, I do for moles, the holes filling with water. For the rest, my new dog takes care of them. Yeah, and so if you've got, if you know where the moles are, flooding the tunnels can work. The problem can be, if you got more than one mole, you can have a whole bunch of tunnels and they'll escape. But yeah, if you can block off some of the tunnels and attempt to drown them, they can live in water for a long time. So that's something that you want to stay up with to try to keep them. Glenn saying, I have a big problem with squirrels digging holes in my raised beds, especially in the fall. What can I place over the top of the beds to keep them from digging? I'm thinking possibly of fencing. Yeah, and so you can put fencing of all types. And so as you may have seen in my most recent short, and the short coming out tomorrow actually shows how I use fencing in these beds right here to hold the straw in place. But I just use a light plastic poultry netting is what it's called. I also use chicken wire, which is a metal poultry fence. And those by themselves are often enough to keep the squirrels from digging. Just something on top of the soil when the plants aren't growing anymore. And I've had great success with that as well. For squirrels, kind of like we were talking about growing strawberries for rabbits, at my last house had a whole bunch of squirrels. And I never had an issue with squirrels in the garden because my neighbor had bird feeders. They had 6 or 8 bird feeders. And so much food was spilled from those bird feeders that's where the squirrels spent all of their time. My brother and sister-in-law have squirrel feeders set up on their fence to keep the squirrels out of the garden. So if you give the squirrels an alternative food that they find easier to eat, then chances are they'll stay out of your garden, or at least not be in the garden as much. But when they want to dig and bury something because you're giving them all these wonderful nuts, putting a barrier like a light fencing can definitely help. That's something that I've used and had great success with it. Okay, let's see what else. Yeah, Hot Pepper Paul recommends the movie The Biggest Little Farm. It's been about a year ago, but I did a live stream months and months ago where I talked about that movie. Great movie, highly recommended. Over the holidays, if you've got some time, look up The Biggest Little Farm. It's a great story of how they were able to develop a farm that was in balance with nature. And that's actually one of the reasons why I always try to get balance and why I allow some of these pests to stay is because of watching that movie and realize that those pests are part of the circle of life. And so you may not want them in your garden, but they may actually be serving an important purpose because of the effect they have on other things that you might not even imagine. So Biggest Little Farm, great suggestion of a movie to be watching on, and it's more than just gardening. There's a lot of philosophy of life in general from that movie, so I think that's great. Arizona Highland Homestead just fed grubs from our compost to the chickens yesterday, uploading a video of them kicking through our compost pile right now. Great, I'll have to check that out. The issue I had with the chickens in this bed last year were that they just kicked all of the wood chip mulch everywhere, and I was getting ready to plant, and they just totally disrupted that bed. But yeah, they're a natural tiller as well. They'll dig in the soil and scratch the soil, and it's a great way to help get some amendment in the soil as they search for those grubs. And they'll mix up your compost the same way. So if you got grubs in your compost pile, the chickens will help turn your pile as they get to the grubs. So that's a great idea. Katie's saying chickens are a gardener's best friend. Mine come squawking from every direction when I throw a grub. They love grubs. Absolutely love grubs. So if you can collect the grubs and feed them, they'll definitely come running every single time. That's great. Cal1699 says, I get grubs in my containers. I just toss them in the yard when I replant. And that's what I tend to do for the grubs as well. I'll leave them on the surface or toss them out of the bed because there's going to be some animal, that most likely a bird, but something that's definitely going to want to feed on those grubs. And if I can encourage them, definitely take it. Zanoni Snowflake is checking in. Hello to you. Glad to see you back. Scott's saying, one of the few benefits of living in a cookie cutter subdivision is there are no rabbits. You know, and you're lucky with that. Kiri can attest to this. She lives in a subdivision in the middle of the city. And we've got one of those cities that we've got a lot of parks, we've got a lot of trees, and we've got a lot of rabbits. So even here in Colorado, in the second biggest city in Colorado with hundreds of thousands of population, we've got rabbits that are running throughout the city just because we have all of the natural area near a lot of our neighborhoods. So cookie cutter neighborhood that is surrounded by other cookie cutter neighborhoods, you'll have less chance of rabbits. But if you live in an area like ours with a lot of parks, don't be surprised to see rabbits. Or deer. We actually have a lot of deer in our neighborhoods with sidewalks and streets and cookie cutter houses. We've got a lot of deer that roam throughout the city as well. But we're in the mountains and they're all part of our natural habitat. So it's not unusual for us, but I could see how it would be unusual for a lot of others. Okay, let's see. Mr. Grimm says, flood those mole holes with garlic water. Messes with their sense of smell, so they avoid it. That's an interesting idea. The garlic is beneficial. I have not seen anything about using garlic water for moles, but it can certainly be worth the effort, I suppose. Mothballs is one of those classic. I've tried to use mothballs in my gopher tunnels before. Haven't really seen whether they have much effect or not, because the gophers always tend to just dig a new tunnel. But definitely something to try if you're willing to take that extra effort. Heidi says, I used bird netting over my straw in my raised beds after seeing me use it. That's great. Works great. And you're very welcome. I'm glad that bird netting worked. Bird netting, another reason why I really like the raised beds. I talked about the hoops that I put in place to cover with plastic to keep the plants warm. It's also great to cover with bird netting if you've got a pest problem at different times of year. It's great to cover with the shade cloth during the middle of summer. And so I really like, getting back to the theme for today, of using raised beds that are all the same size, because I can use the hoops with the bird netting or the plastic or the shade cloth that's already been cut to size, and I can move it around from bed to bed. And so as I'm growing different plants at different times of year in the different beds, I can still use all of those covers with the hoops and just pull them out of the shed and put them into place. You can do that in an open ground bed, but I think it's a little bit more effort, and you usually don't have those same size plots in the ground that you might have so easy to measure in a raised bed, that you choose the same size for all of your beds. So there's something that if you like that interchangeability. The same with drip systems. If you do gardening with drip irrigation, you can just move the drip irrigation from one bed to another when you've got a raised bed as you're swapping plants back and forth. It tends to be a little more permanent in an in-ground bed. So irrigation is a consideration when you're deciding about raised beds or not raised beds. You can have soaker hoses laid out for 50, 200 feet in an in-ground level garden bed much easier than you can in a raised bed. Irrigation does tend to be a little more difficult in a raised bed, but it's one of those things. I like to do hand watering mostly, And a raised bed brings the plants closer up to my eye and to the water wand, and it gives me a better opportunity to see what's happening with the plants. And if I'm watering standing up at an in-ground bed, well, that's an extra 2 to 3 feet away that those plants are growing, and I might miss something that's happening with those plants where I can see them easier in a raised bed. Another reason why I like to have the raised beds. Mr. Graham says, grow sunflowers away from your main garden for those squirrels. Save the seed that survives. Give them to your neighbors that have feeders. Great idea. I'm cutting off the seed heads from the sunflowers that I grew on the side of the house, primarily for the birds. But yeah, that's a good point about the squirrels. Same idea that we were talking about earlier, where you feed the squirrels. And I would say I did this with my neighbor accidentally, but it could have just as easily been done on purpose. Some of my sunflower plants, the seed spread to his yard, and he loves the plants, so he's allowing those plants to grow in his yard. So encourage that your neighbors grow sunflowers to feed the squirrels and everything else. If you can have the squirrels go to your neighbor's yard because they've got more sunflowers or whatever kind of plant than yours, that's a win for your garden as well. So bring your neighbors into the picture and of the prevention of some of these pests, and give them the same plants you're growing, give them the plants to grow as well. And it's one of those things that it becomes a multi-prong attack for those pests that you're trying to deal with if all of your neighbors could be on the same page and growing the same type of plants. Okay, let's see what else. Lisa's wondering about the name of the movie again. There's a bunch of links around. I think I just saw a link that Jay put. There it is, The Biggest Little Farm. And there's a link to it on YouTube. You can actually find it. I think it's on Amazon Prime. I'm not sure if it's on Netflix, but there's definitely some options. And thank you, Jay, for posting that. It really is an enjoyable movie. So consider it a holiday movie that you can add to your list of things that you want to do. Okay, let's see. Getting close. Just want to try to pack in as many questions that I can answer as possible. So I'm scrolling down to see what it happens to be. Patricia says, tons of sunflower seeds from last year. Plant the seeds from the best plants. Can't wait. Good for you. Yeah, I had planned to do a sunflower growing video this year and just got busy doing all the other videos. So I'm hoping to do that. But that's part of what I'll show, is how you can grow sunflowers, save the seeds, and grow more sunflowers. And I think that's a great idea. Sunflowers are just a wonderful plant. If you're not growing sunflowers, you should. And John has a good point, as long as your neighbors aren't too concerned with it. But yeah, grow sunflowers throughout the neighborhood. They're such a beautiful plant. They do so much for the wildlife. They can really help with the soil. If you've got bad soil, they can really help break it apart and decompact compacted soil, and do some seed bombs of sunflowers in open areas and get some sunflowers growing. And they'll definitely come back, because they'll drop the seeds. Now the birds will eat most of the seeds of the seed heads that are in place, but there are hundreds of seeds in a big sunflower head, and some of those seeds will root and come back. I've done that in areas of my garden before, where I basically just let the sunflowers naturalize. They drop their seeds, and whatever pops up the next year, I let grow, and now you've got a big patch of sunflowers that come back every single year. And it's one of my favorite plants. And yeah, Cal's right. They love clay soil, and so it's a plant that'll grow almost anywhere in just about any region. It doesn't matter if you live in a cold region or a warm region. There are sunflower plants that you can grow. So definitely go for it. Nikki grew 10 different types. I grew 5 different types this year, but definitely glad to see that you're doing it next year. Jersey Girl says, never had luck growing sunflowers. And so I'll definitely have that video coming out hopefully next year. And you can see once they get started, they got to get that start. and they can be a little more difficult in my area because I don't have a lot of natural rainfall in spring. So I do have to keep the sunflowers watered early on. But after that, it's almost foolproof. So it's getting them started initially, and once they get growing, in most cases, they'll keep growing without too many issues. Greg says, squirrels and birds planted a large black oil sunflower patch below my bird feeders, left it, they were covered with bees. And that's what I did back here, just out of the frame is where I've got my bird feeder. And that's what I've done in that area as well. Some of the sunflower seeds from the bird feed fell, and I allowed them to grow this year. And there's some really nice small sunflower plants. I grew a lot of big sunflowers in my front yard, and so I've allowed some of those to naturalize just like you, Greg. So that's great. I'm glad to see it. Okay, let's see. Lisa's talking about Sunflower Steve on Instagram. I haven't heard of Sunflower Steve. Developing some new varieties. Awesome. We could go check out Sunflower Steve and see what he's doing. And sunflowers, so when you buy a sunflower seed of a particular variety, and there are a number of varieties out there that you can get. I actually grew a Pike's Peak, which is about 10 feet tall, and I live in the shadow of Pike's Peak, so it's great. If you want a specific variety of a sunflower based on the height or the color or the size, then you'll want to buy the seed. If you're growing multiple varieties, they will cross-pollinate, and you can develop your own variety if you really want to. So that's probably what he's doing, is he's doing some intentional cross-pollination to develop new varieties. But you can do that just on your own with nature as the bees are flitting from one flower to the next. And then if you save those seeds, grow them, you might not be surprised that you're going to see a plant that is totally different than whatever it was you were growing there before. And that's a lot of fun with just allowing cross-pollination in your garden. So I haven't done it intentionally, but I think that's a good idea to try to get some new sunflowers growing. And that is one of those, when you're naturalizing a plant like that the strongest plant, the strongest hybrid will end up being dominant in that particular area. So if you're allowing plants like sunflowers to cross-pollinate and you're allowing those seeds to grow, eventually the plant that does best for your area is the plant that's going to be the one that takes over that area. And it could be a completely new hybrid that you've developed by allowing that. And then once it stabilizes, you've created a new plant. It takes years for that to happen, but it is a lot of fun if you can ever get to that point. Okay, let's see what we have. A couple more here. Nikki's saying, yes, cross-pollination, save seeds from my sunflowers, and I'm hoping for new kinds. Good for you. So I'm glad that that's the approach you're taking. Patricia got mammoth sunflower seeds. I think I'll plant them along the road. That'd be cool. There's, on the way to the Denver airport here in Colorado, there are fields and fields of sunflowers. I'm not sure what they're being used for, whether it's a bird feed company or some other reason. But to be driving and just see sunflowers along the road, that really is a beautiful, beautiful thing to see. So good for you. Mammoths really are a big sunflower. Jay says, I save seed for economic reasons and get a wide variety of results. Absolutely. Saving seed is just one of it's fun, it's easy, it saves money. And yeah, there's a lot of reasons to be doing it. So, Scott, nice that you dropped in on us today. Always good to see you here. Hope you have a great Thanksgiving, and we'll see you on YouTube. Thanks. I know you got to run, but I appreciate you being here. That's always nice. Okay, let's see a couple more, and then we'll get to the philosophy phase. Patricia's saying, I'm trying for huge one. My biggest was about 10 inches, not including the foliage. And so I actually at the school, and it might have been the Pike's Peak sunflower, but we actually had some heads that were 12 to 15 inches across. And so it's awesome when, especially with the kids at the school, to harvest some of those big sunflower seeds, because it's bigger than anything they've ever seen before as a flower and as a plant. So it's an awesome way to go, especially if you've got kids. Grow sunflowers because you'll amaze the kids. Okay, let's go ahead. And so a couple days ago, Saturday, I attended a meeting of our garden club, and it had been about a year and a half. We've had 2 meetings now since we got back together again. And it really got me thinking to share with you some thoughts about garden clubs in general. For weeks, I've been talking about choosing ways for you to learn more, particularly during the winter months, focusing on different things in your garden that you want to learn more about. And I realized at the meeting this weekend that the garden club, and I've known this all along, but I'm sharing this idea as I started formulating some thoughts on it. A garden club is a great way to really help direct some of your gardening activities in ways that you might not have thought about. So in our garden club, we had about, I think 16 or 18 people at this meeting, and we'll be as high as 30 on some meetings. And it's just a bunch of gardeners to get together. Well, there are some like me that know a lot, but most of the people at the garden club know almost nothing about gardening. They joined our garden club to learn about gardening from gardeners like me. And so regardless of what skill level you have, if you haven't thought about joining a garden club in your area, I think you should think about it. If you're the experienced gardener, and you may not realize that you are as experienced as you are until you get exposed to other gardeners who know less, and now you become the expert in a particular area, which I think is awesome. Or if you're the brand new gardener who knows nothing, but you can rub elbows with those that live in your area and they've made those mistakes to teach you so that you don't make those mistakes, what can be better than that? You get to meet gardeners, you get to expand your network, and you get to either be helpful or be helped with other gardeners. And that's the thought for the day, is find a garden club, join a garden club. Most of them are active in the winter because there's nothing you can be doing out in the garden of great purpose. So you get together and share what's going on. You share seeds. Most garden clubs have a seed swap. At our meeting, we were talking about a plant swap in the summer. So we're already planning for a nice little get together at somebody's garden where we'll have a potluck and we'll swap plants. These are some of the things that a plant club can offer you. And most places around the world have some type of organization of gardeners. Now, in my area, we have at least half a dozen, probably 10 organizations with plant club in their name. And so they'll be divided by different neighborhoods. And so we've got the Broadmoor Plant Club, and we've got the Rock Rimmon Plant Club, we've got the Falcon Plant Club. These are all different neighborhoods in the city where I'm at. That's a good place to start. And so go to the nurseries, go to your neighbors. Chances are, if you haven't thought about finding a plant club, somebody you know or somebody that you encounter will know about a plant club in your area. There are more formal organizations like rose societies and iris societies and orchid societies. That's another great option as well. If you are focusing on a particular type of gardening, well, then find a club, an organization, a society that is also focused on that particular area. It's a great way to just be more involved with gardening and learn more along the way. And so as we move into the holidays and we're doing more socializing, this might be a place to start. It's been 2 years ago now, but the holiday party that the plant club has every year was the second meeting I had ever been to. I went to a plant club meeting when I first moved here 2 years ago, and then went to the holiday party as a brand new member, met other members, got to know some of them, and became involved with the garden club. As probably doesn't surprise you, they elected me president because they wanted me there at every meeting so I can answer their questions. I told them this is my last year because I want to just be a member and not have to be such a big role in the club. But you've got that opportunity. You can take a big role and become the president or vice president or secretary or however the club is set up. Or you can just sit in the background and listen and take notes and learn, because most clubs, as part of their meetings, will have a lesson. They'll have a speaker. They'll have a film. They'll have something that is part of the club at every single meeting. And so if you don't know about clubs, look into them. And so all of you out there, if you're a member of a club, let us know. Let us know what the club is that you're a member of. Or if you're interested in becoming a club member, you can share that with us as well. And most clubs nowadays also have a website. We've got a website. And so you can do a search of your city and just put garden club in the search. And you should have some hits with the websites of garden clubs in your area. And then usually those websites will tell you when they meet and how to become a member. There might be minimal dues. We pay $15 a year, and that money goes towards donations. So we gave a donation to the library. We gave a donation to our fire department. We use some of that money to pay for holiday get-togethers. And it's just a way for us to help give back to the community as well. Our club is responsible for a couple different gardens that are planted at the library where we meet. And so another great way to give back to the community is we manage these gardens that the public sees on a daily basis. All the people that are visiting our library walk past the gardens that we manage. And it's nothing fancy. It's native plants. It's the plants in our area that do well, that don't require a lot of work. And a couple times a year, we get together and clean up the garden so that it looks good as part of club activities. And so I just really enjoyed getting with the group of gardeners this last weekend, my fellow club members, and I wanted to share that with you as an idea. If you don't have a garden club and you have other gardeners that you associate with, well, consider forming a garden club. I actually helped a club form years ago in the Master Gardener program, where I went and helped them set up a club. And it started with just a handful of members. But the last I heard, they have a couple dozen members. So all kinds of opportunities that you can take as a gardener if you become involved with a garden club. So I hope that some of you take that action, and then you can report back to us in the live stream in days ahead if you have some meetings or what you've learned from your garden club or the best things about your garden club. It's something that I think too few gardeners actually participate in, and especially if you're growing in a challenging area like mine. I'm surprised that we don't have more gardeners in our garden clubs, because we do have a very challenging environment here in Colorado. And one of the best ways to grow successfully is to rub elbows with the other gardeners out there who are growing in your same area, who have grown successfully, and they'll share their tips. And so when you're buddies in a club, you get all the great tips, which is something I like to do, is share my tips. But even I learn something at every meeting we go to. And it's tips galore, because there's so many different ways to garden, even in the same climate and same area. People do it differently. Colorado Bird Nerd, thank you so much for that super chat. I appreciate it. I let my bird feeder sunflower seed that dropped and sprouted grow into a little wildflower patch this year. So pretty, and the local deer ate them. That's awesome. I've done that as well. I'm actually going to move my bird feeder this next year because I had it above my little pond and fountain, and a lot of that seed fell in and really made it more difficult to clean the pond area. But that's what I'm going to do as I move it, is just let it fall and let it grow. And I'm allowing that to happen as well, to see what pops up. So those little sunflowers this year were great. I had some little thistles that popped up this year that I really liked them as well. So a great idea. I appreciate that suggestion, because it not only can look good as it grows, but definitely provides some food for the wildlife in your area. And I'm all about, like the movie, watch the movie, you'll see how important the wildlife is. Even the wildlife you don't want is important to get your garden in balance. And so it could be as simple as just letting your bird seed fall and grow and allow the deer to eat that instead of eating the plants that you don't want them to grow. It's all learning how to do it. Mr. Grimm says, this is my garden club that I attend. That's awesome. And that's actually a good point. I love to be here every Monday. Love to have you here every Monday, because I do think we are a bit of a club. And even though I'm doing all the talking, there's a lot of communication that's going on in the comments as well. So thanks for saying that, because that is a nice observation, that we are a club, the GardenerScott Gardening Club, if you want to say it that way. And so it's nice to have it here. Nikki, thanks so much for that. You're welcome. I'm going to give my thanks back to all of you. The week of Thanksgiving here in the United States is an opportunity for us to get together and think about the year and to give thanks. And so I definitely give thanks to all of you for your time with me and allowing me to have such a wonderful time every Monday in this club of ours of global gardeners, that we can share our information and know that this is a nice place with supportive people at every level. And all the moderators in particular have been such a great help and are a continual help every single week. So Jay and Heidi and Kiri, thank you so much for all you do to keep this channel going and to keep this live stream as wonderful as it is. I hope that everyone who celebrates Thanksgiving this week has a wonderful Thanksgiving, and I look forward to seeing you back here again, same time and place, next Monday. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.